Welcome back. I'm Shane, and this is Relative Time. And today we're going to take a look at one of the more complicated mechanical watches I've seen to date. And pay particular attention to that subdial at the bottom. Now, this Pierre Paulin branded watch is another one that is courtesy of Merkur watches. Shortly after I reviewed their Panda chronograph, they reached out and said, hey, we have a new watch we'd like you to check out. This one is a bit dressier, but it's still a chronograph, and this one actually has a Moonphase. And that last one really piqued my interest. Now, generally speaking, mechanical or automatic chronographs are very cool, very complicated, and very pricey. One of the few exceptions to that are those that use a set of rather inexpensive mechanical movements from Seagull. At first, people were a bit wary of these Chinese movements, but they have been gaining more and more traction and have started to become more accepted, even to the point that some non-Chinese microbrands are now using these movements. And that Panda that I just mentioned is one of those with a Seagull movement. And since I thought Merkur did a great job with that one, I was kind of curious to see what they could do with a dress watch version. So I said yes. And just like that Panda, this is also a watch I get to keep, hence that promotional tag at the beginning. Now, just like that Panda, this is a smaller, more classically sized watch at 38mm. It also shares 30 meters of water resistance and an 18mm lug width, but that's where most of the similarities stop. And that's 38mm wide without the crown. Width is only 40.5. With this one, you're also looking at a lug-to-lug of 47. So as a whole, I think it'll fit a variety of wrist sizes, from slim to above average. And on my 7-inch wrist, it sat squarely where it needed to be, as well as it was a watch that was surprisingly comfortable throughout the day, which was in part due to its light weight of 65 grams and a custom molded leather strap that seemed to conform to my wrist perfectly, or at least it did for a little while. I wound up having an issue with that strap, and that's one I'll get to in a bit, but let's first wrap up the specs. Now, while the footprint is a great size for most people, this one is a bit of a chunky monkey, having a total thickness of 16mm. Although a lot of that can be attributed to the rather complicated movement, as well as the nice domed polymer crystal and a very, very open exhibition case back. So it is kind of understandable why this thing is so thick. But 16mm is a bit tall for a dress watch, no matter what's going on under the hood. And with this smaller footprint, I think it looks even taller in proportion. When looking straight down at the watch, you mostly see the polished clean bezel and the edge of that crystal that catches the light. And that's about it. The overall case design is rather simple. There's no beveled edges or any extra frills here, just a decent polished finish over every surface. And that is very fitting for a dress watch. And like most dress watches that have polished finishes everywhere, this one can be a bit of a fingerprint magnet. Now, that polished finish even extends to the screw-down exhibition case back, and there you can see the Seagull 2908 movement, as it has its own really nice finish. Now, we'll talk more about the specifics of the movement at the end, but I think it's clear just by looking at it that Seagull knows how to make a good-looking movement. Now, keeping with the vintage aesthetic, Merkur went with a polymer domed crystal, and that comes with the typical pros and cons of a polymer versus, say, mineral or sapphire crystal. The polymer is cheaper, lighter weight, and highly impact resistant. It's also much easier to buff out any scratches yourself, yet it's also a softer material, and therefore it's much easier to get scratches to begin with. And at a total height of 16mm here, that is going to be something you'll have to worry about. Now, as I've said before, personally, I'd rather avoid scratches in the first place, so I usually prefer sapphire. But a lot of people love and swear by polymer, and especially in this type of watch. And I have to admit, it does look good here. The overall design can be a bit reflective, but most of the time the crystal is clear and perfectly at home with the vintage aesthetics of the dial, especially at certain angles, where the slight distortion of the crystal seems to enhance the presence of the Roman numerals and the texture of the subdials. Now, there is no doubt here that this dial is gorgeous, but it is rather complicated and a bit crowded. So if you're into more streamlined and cleaner dials, you'll probably want to look at some other chronographs. For the most part, this watch has a flat black dial with white painted highlights, and that should offer a ton of contrast, at least in theory, as well as a ton of usability. Which it mostly does, but there are a few spots that it doesn't, and I'll specifically address that as we go. Now, starting at the far edge and then moving in, we have a detailed train track chapter ring, and that sits right at the edge of the crystal's distortion, which actually works quite well, as the light hitting the edge of the crystal and then reflects off it acts to highlight and outline the dial itself. The chapter ring looks great here, and even includes Arabic numerals for a minute track as it goes along. Yet the font there is so small, you might not notice that at first, or even be able to easily read it once you do. Moving inward, we have Roman numerals acting as hour indicators, and the dial here has a smoother texture. Now shortly after that, the dial then drops down to a more textured finish, as well as introduces the 4 subdials. Well, 3 subdials and a Moonphase. The 3 subdials all have the same circular pattern emanating from it, and a small white hand that boldly stands out against the black backdrop. Now starting at the 12, we have a date subdial, and that's something that I think always looks elegant and is a perfect addition to any dress watch. Yet, I also find them really hard to use. The numbers are always so small that it's always hard to make them out. So that's something that's a bit more form than, say, function. Now, moving to the 3, we have the minutes elapsed for the chronograph, and then the running seconds at the 9. While down below, just above the 6, we have the moon phase complication, which, once synced up to the actual phase of the moon, should advance 1 position a day, and then give you a pretty good idea what phase the moon will be in each night. And at the bottom half of that moon phase, you have a small amount of text, and that's one that depicts the brand and the features of the watch. I think the way the text is presented here is well done. It really doesn't take up a ton of space, yet it's still prominently displayed. And I gotta say, I'm still not a fan of that name. I'd rather have it just say Merkur. But I already went into all that with the Panda video, so I'll save you from that here. Now, you may have already noticed early on that there were 2 recessed buttons on this side of the watch, and these are to manually control the date and the moon phase complication. With the watch in a safe position, pressing the top will advance the date, and pushing the bottom will slowly advance the moon phase. They are recessed enough that you shouldn't accidentally hit them, but you will need some sort of tool every time you set the watch. Now, moving to the right side, you have the crown and the chronograph pushers. And this works just like any other chronograph out there. The top pusher starts and stops, while the bottom one resets the whole thing. And as this is a mechanical movement, you really get a nice response to each pusher and a smooth sweep of that white second hand when you use it. If you've never experienced one, it's a whole lot better than your typical quartz chrono. Now, at the moment, I believe there are 2 different colorways. You have a blue one and this black version. And while I think the black version looks a whole lot better, I think the blue one will be easier to use. As you can see, they decided to use Dauphine hands. And while they do look great with this kind of design and are perfectly appropriate for a dress watch, they can be difficult to use depending on the lighting. And especially so when you're trying to capture them on film. They just seem to reflect the light in the room. And in more of a studio setting, the rest of the room is black, and that's just what it reflects. Which on a blue watch wouldn't be that bad, but here it just sort of blends into the backdrop. Now in real life, the hands aren't quite as bad as some of these shots make it out to be, but every once in a while it can be. So just something to be aware of with this one. These hands do look good when you notice them, but they don't have near the contrast that the rest of the white hands do on this dial. Now, overall, it's a great, yet complicated looking watch. A very classic and elegant looking design, but perhaps one that could use a little more fine tuning. Now, as far as the movement goes, it's listed as a Chinese Seagull 2908. I'm personally not familiar with it, but I believe it shares a lot of the same DNA as the ST2901, which was on that previous Panda. Yet this one doesn't share that same swan neck upgrade that the Panda did, although it's still a standard beat rate, and it's a movement with hand winding, but no hacking. And accuracy on this specific one was just acceptable, at about plus 15 seconds a day. Now, I'm probably going to be repeating myself from a lot of previous videos here, but I think this is important enough to talk about again. Typically, people avoid Chinese movements, and they prefer to stick with Japanese or Swiss, as there's just a lot more of a proven track record with those, and they're seen as more reliable. However, these Seagull chronographs are starting to become an exception, and as I said, they're even starting to pop up in some non-Chinese microbrands. And that's mostly because it lets them create an affordable mechanical chronograph. If you wanted a name brand Swiss chrono, you're going to be paying at least 5 to 8 times as much as this, which is typically why in this price range, quartz chronographs are king. But as I said, these Seagull ones are gaining in popularity, and they are fantastic to look at. However, at this time, I still can't tell you how reliable they are going to be as a whole. So if that's really a concern, it's better to stick with quartz or start saving up for something big. I can say that so far I haven't had any problem with the ones I've seen. And the only negative thing I can say from my own experiences is that the ticking on these is a bit loud. And again, it's not quite Timex loud, but I can definitely hear it in a quiet room from about arm's length. So again, if that's something you're sensitive to, just be aware of that here. Now, as far as the strap goes, well, like I said, I had an issue. It's this black alligator style leather strap, and while it's not the best quality leather, it looks really good here, especially with it being molded to the watch, and that really helps it feel comfortable on the wrist. But unfortunately, when I first swapped this strap out, I noticed that one of the spring bars looked a little bent, and I thought that one of the causes could have been more pressure on it just due to how the strap is designed and how it sits in the watch. Now, it actually took some doing getting this strap out, and when I did, I realized that it wasn't bent, but actually broken too. And the only reason that it hadn't fallen out or the watch fallen to the ground was because it was really jammed in there. And just due to the way they designed the strap, they used a really thin spring bar here, and the replacements I have won't fit in this particular strap. So right now I can't use it. But luckily I got a lot of shots off, and I did get a wrist shot on before this happened. So as a whole, I think this is a great idea, but it might be one that needs a little bit more work. Now, price on this one is listed at $269, but Merkur did give me a discount code which brings it down to $219. And that is a pretty decent price for a Seagull based chronograph. Generally, they seem to range from about $200 all the way up to $350. So $219 isn't bad, and at this price, there's going to be some out there that will see this and just really fall in love with this watch. There might be someone out there who's been dying for an affordable Moonphase as well as an affordable chronograph, and this could be exactly what they want, and might even be worth getting as long as you are aware of the shortcomings I pointed out. Yet, if you like the idea of a mechanical chronograph at this price, but not particularly this style, then I'd definitely recommend checking out that previous Panda, or at least a number of the 1963 clones out there. Yet for me personally, well, I gotta say that this is a great looking watch, but it's not quite my cup of tea. I just prefer dress watches with a simpler design, as well as ones that are a bit thinner. And I would recommend some fine tuning on this one, and specifically changing out the hands to something else, like say a leaf or a baguette style handset in white, just to add more contrast, and I think it would look better next to those subdial hands. But the real question is, what do you think about this dress watch chrono from Merkur? Let me know down below. Or if you can think of another dress watch I should take a look at, feel free to mention that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time.